Today's Chalk Talk will investigate how command and data handling errors affected Boeing's test flight of their CST-100 Starliner in December of 2019. To better understand the significance of this test, let's take a quick look at NASA's Commercial Crew Space program. In 2011, the Space Shuttle Atlantis landed for the last time, retiring the United States' only manned space vehicle with no replacement. NASA took a new acquisition approach when sourcing the shuttle's replacement. NASA identified a requirement: a safe, reliable, and cost-effective means of getting humans to low Earth orbit, including the International Space Station, and return safely to Earth. NASA allowed bidding companies to control their design and production with oversight from NASA experts. NASA began investing capital into commercial companies in 2010, and both Boeing and SpaceX were offered full contracts to build the CST-100 Starliner and the Dragon crew capsules, respectively. Development by both companies were kickstarted, and astronauts were selected to work with each company to guide them towards meeting NASA's objectives. Testing continued to ramp up, and demonstration flights were conducted on launch, abort, and landing each spacecraft. On December 20th, Boeing conducted their first unmanned test flight. The capsule contained supplies and Christmas presents for the crew of the International Space Station. The Atlas V rocket had a flawless launch. Once in low Earth orbit, Starliner relied on its onboard computers to autonomously ignite its own engine at a certain time in order to reach its intended rendezvous orbit. 15 seconds after separating from its second stage, Mission Control detected an anomaly. Unknown to them at the time, Starliner's internal clock was 11 hours off. Because the vehicle was on an inaccurate timescale, the Starliner thought it had already completed its ignition, so the main engines didn't fire when they were supposed to. Instead, the spacecraft's thrusters did fire, as if the main engine had ignited in order to steady the vehicle as it climbed to space, which it wasn't actually doing. This maneuver burned too much fuel and prevented the Boeing team from rising Starliner's orbit far enough to reach the space station. There was also a communication issue. Once they realized the spacecraft wasn't burning its primary engines, Boeing sent a command to jumpstart the process. The only problem? Starliner was in a communication dead zone, too far from satellites that would have relayed the commands to the spacecraft, so it didn't receive the notification from the ground in time. By the time they did reestablish communication, it was too late. They had missed their window and used too much of their onboard fuel, and Boeing decided to take Starliner into a different orbit, one that would make it easier for the vehicle to come home a few days later. After the failed test, an investigation was opened and more errors were identified. Let's take a closer look.
Everything started off looking great with a flawless launch on a United Launch Alliance Atlas V in the N22 configuration, meaning that there's no payload fairing as Starliner sits atop the rocket, 2 solid rocket boosters, and a twin-engine Centaur upper stage. But at this precise moment, separation of Starliner from that Centaur upper stage, that is exactly where everything began to go wrong. Immediately, the onboard timer placed Starliner into a configuration that was incorrect for that moment in the flight. Thruster firings that shouldn't have happened were happening. Attitudes were out of control. Very bad things were occurring. Now, after getting Starliner into a stable orbit, an abort of an attempt to dock at the International Space Station was called, therefore losing its biggest milestone in this test flight. Instead, Starliner was set to fly solo and work on other tests that could be done in such a configuration. Boeing hastily conducted a review of all of the software that was on board of Starliner and found that the parameters to jettison the service module were way out of where they should have actually been. That meant that just before re-entry, when the service module was released, it could have re-impacted Starliner and caused a destructive re-entry. Luckily, Boeing was able to patch together new software, upload that into Starliner, and the potential loss of vehicle and crew event was averted, and the capsule safely landed at White Sands in New Mexico. Now, a review after the flight found 61 corrective actions for Boeing to take. And credit where credit is due, Boeing fessed up to its errors and admitted that it had made major mistakes.
As Boeing continues to address issues identified by the test and make plans for its next test flight, SpaceX is pushing forward with its first human test flight later this month. Whether on an autonomous empty crew capsule or a single satellite in orbit, onboard computers play a vital role in ensuring the spacecraft's operating as intended. Errors in code or hardware, if not tested for properly, could have catastrophic results in the end.